The manager fired her in front of 40 people, mid-shift, with a full coffee pot still in her hand. He did it loud. He did it on purpose. He called her a thief across a crowded dining room so that everyone chewing their lunch would hear it. And in about 10 minutes, this same woman is going to be standing on a hot Tucson sidewalk with a cardboard box and no job and no way to pay the rent, while the man who ruined her counts the register and smiles. But there is a stranger at the counter who has been watching all of it, nursing the same cup of coffee for 40 minutes. And before this is over, he will do something that costs that manager far more than a paycheck, and leave behind a $1 bill that a little girl will stare at for 50 years. April 1958, Tucson, Arizona. Downtown, 2 blocks from the old Southern Pacific depot, where the noon train still shakes the coffee cups in their saucers. It is 91 degrees outside, and the swamp cooler is losing the fight. The diner is the Copper Spur, a chrome and vinyl lunchroom packed shoulder to shoulder with railroad men, shop clerks, and secretaries on their half hour. The grill hisses, the fans turn, and in the middle of it all, a woman in a yellow uniform stands frozen on the dining room floor, her face gone the color of ash, a coffee pot trembling in her hand. Her name is Dela Hartman. She is 44 years old. Her husband has been dead 3 years. She has 2 children at home and a third in the ground. And the job she is about to lose is the only thing standing between her family and the street. At the far end of the counter, on the last stool by the window, a tall man in a plain work shirt sets down his cup. He has been watching the whole thing unfold. The manager coming out of the back, the ledger under his arm, the careful, cruel theatre of it. And now, slow, he is reaching into his shirt pocket. A busboy clearing plates does a double take at the man's face and forgets he's holding a tray. Nobody recognizes him yet. By the end of this, you'll wish you'd known his name. Here is the story. To understand why a loud firing could destroy Dela Hartman, you have to understand how little stood between her and ruin, and how far she had already fallen to get to that diner floor. She was born Dela Cruz in 1914, in Bisbee, Arizona, a copper town carved into a canyon where the whole economy belonged to one mining company. Her father went down the shaft at 14 and came up at 50 with a cough that killed him before he saw 60. Her mother took in boarders and washed other people's sheets. Della learned 2 things before she was 10, that a working family lives 1 bad week from disaster, and that the people who own things rarely lose a wink of sleep over the people who don't. Those 2 lessons followed her the rest of her life. She married Frank Hartmann in 1936, a brakeman on the Southern Pacific, a steady man with a good laugh and bad luck. He gave her the only stretch of ease she ever knew, 8 years where the money came regular and the children came laughing. They had 3. They buried the middle one, a boy named Sammy, to scarlet fever in the spring of 1944, and Della carried that small grave with her into every single shift she ever worked after. You learn, burying a child, that the world does not stop to ask if you can bear the next thing. It just sends the next thing. The next thing came in 1955. A coupling failed in the Tucson rail yard, and a string of loaded cars rolled where they had no business rolling, and Frank Hartmann was between them. The railroad called it an accident. They sent a man in a grey suit who said the company regretted the loss, and they paid Della $200, and they considered the matter closed. She was 39 years old, a widow, with a 15-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son, and a rented house she could not begin to hold on $200. So, she put on a yellow uniform and went to work at the Copper Spur. And she was good. Not just quick, good. She was the kind of waitress who remembered that the day foreman took his coffee black and bitter and hated to be asked twice. She remembered that the widow Pearson liked her toast burned nearly black and was too proud to send it back if it came soft. She remembered that the nervous young man who came in every afternoon studying fat law books for the bar examination would forget to drink water for 2 hours if she didn't fill his glass without a word. She knew the regulars the way a country doctor knows his patients. She worked doubles when the rent came due. She covered other girls' shifts when their babies were sick. She came in on Christmas Day, twice, so the girls with families could stay home. And still it was never enough, because it never is for a widow holding a house on tips. She sold her wedding ring in 1956 to fix a roof that had started letting the monsoon in over the children's beds. She sold Frank's good pocket watch in 1957 to pay the doctor when her boy took pneumonia, and they weren't sure for 3 nights he'd live. And last winter, The hardest thing. She sold Frank's brakeman's lantern, the one he'd carried 20 years on the line, the one thing of his she had sworn on his grave she would never part with. She sold it to a railroad collector for $11 to keep the lights on through January. She cried in the alley behind the diner for 10 minutes, and then she wiped her face and went back in and poured coffee, because the lunch crowd was waiting, and tears don't pay rent. Now here is the part that matters most, the quiet wound underneath all the others. For 3 years, Dela Hartman had been robbed, and she didn't even know it. The Copper Spur ran what the company called a register policy. At the end of every shift, the manager counted the cash drawer, and if it came up short of what the receipt said it should hold, the difference was docked straight out of the waitress on duty. It was meant, on paper, to stop theft. In practice, it was a license to skim, because the man counting the drawer was the same man who set the number it was supposed to match. And Della's drawer came up short more than anyone's. A few pennies at first, then a quarter here, $1 there. Then, over the months, more. She could not understand it. She counted her own change twice. She chased customers out the door to return a nickel she'd overpaid. She was honest to a fault, almost to a sickness, because a poor woman knows her honesty is the only thing nobody can take from her. And yet, month after month, her tips came up light, eaten by shortages she could not explain and could not prove, because the only proof was in a ledger kept by the one man who profited from it. His name was Royce Tilden, and in April of 1958, Royce Tilden needed Dela Hartman gone. Royce Tilden was 36 years old, the new district manager sent down from the Copper Spur's parent company up in Phoenix, and he was not a screaming brute. That is precisely what made him dangerous. He wore a narrow tie and a pressed white shirt, even in the desert heat, and he spoke in the calm, reasonable voice of a man who has read the policy and found it standing squarely on his side. He never raised a fist. He never had to. He had a ledger, and in his world, the ledger was God. Tilden had 2 problems that April, and he was the kind of man who liked to solve 2 problems with one move. The first problem was that the parent company's auditors up in Phoenix had finally noticed 3 years of register shortages at the Tucson location, adding up to a number large enough that somebody was going to have to answer for it. The second problem was closer to home. Tilden's wife had a nephew, a soft, feckless young man named Curtis, who'd been let go from 2 jobs already, and the family wanted him placed. And Della Hartman's lunch station happened to be the best tipping shift in the whole house. Solve both at once. Pin the 3 years of shortages on the widow, hand her station to the nephew, and walk away looking like the manager who found the leak and plugged it. It was, as men like Royce Tilden always say to themselves, just business, nothing personal. The numbers required it. And he chose the noon rush to do it, on purpose, because a public example keeps the other girls quiet for a year. He came out of the back office at 12:10, a black ledger book under his arm, and he stopped in the middle of the floor and raised his voice so the whole room would turn. "Mrs. Hartman, stop right where you are." The clatter of forks died. Della stopped in the center of the floor, the coffee pot in her hand, 3 cups still unpoured. "This register," Tilden said, opening the ledger and holding it up like a prosecutor holding up the murder weapon, "has come up short 41 separate times in the past year. $68.40. Every one of those shortages falls on your shift, Mrs. Hartman. Every single one." He let the number hang in the air. "Company policy on this point is not vague. I have no choice in the matter." "Mr. Tilden." Della's voice was low and steady, though her hand had begun to shake. "I have never in my life taken a penny that wasn't mine. You can ask anyone in this room. The drawer says otherwise, and the drawer doesn't lie." He turned, slow, so the whole diner could hear him deliver it. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Leave your apron and your order pad on the counter. And Mrs. Hartman," he allowed himself the smallest pause, the cruelest one, "consider yourself fortunate I am not telephoning the police over $68.40. The Copper Spur had gone dead silent. 40 people, forks frozen halfway to their mouths, every eye on the woman in the yellow uniform. And here is the true cruelty of it, the part that is so much worse than a slap. Royce Tilden did not need to do this in front of anyone. He could have called Della into the back office and done it quietly, kindly even, and she'd have had her dignity to walk out with. He did it in the open, precisely because a humiliated woman does not fight back, and a watching room full of working people learns in that instant to keep its own head down and its own complaints to itself. He put a widow's entire reputation, 3 years of honest work, every kindness she'd ever done a regular, on a scale against $68 he himself had almost certainly skimmed, and he let the policy hold the knife so his own hand would look clean. A reasonable cruelty, a procedural cruelty, with a ledger held up high for proof. Dela Hartman set the coffee pot down on the counter, because her hand was shaking too badly now to be trusted with it. She reached behind her and untied her apron. She lifted the little folded paper cap off her hair. Her face had gone past white into something stiller and more frightening. The flat, hollow calm of a person watching the last floorboard drop away beneath her feet. She was not crying. She was somewhere past crying. "My children," she said quietly. It was not an argument. She wasn't asking him for anything. It was just a fact she said out loud, to the room, to no one. "My children." "You should have thought of your children," Tilden said, snapping the ledger shut, "before you got light-fingered with the till." A sound went through the room then. Not words, just a low intake of breath from 40 people at once. The sound a crowd makes when a line has been crossed. Tilden didn't hear it. Men like him never do. Della picked up her order pad off the counter, the one personal thing she kept there. Dog-eared, curled at the corners, every regular's order penciled inside in her own private shorthand. 3 years of a town's habits and likes, and small kindnesses recorded in a dime store notebook. She slid it into her purse. She squared her shoulders, and she turned to walk out the door into the 91-degree heat, into the rest of a life that had just lost its only flaw. 40 people watched a widow walk toward that door, and not one of them said a single word. Except, at the far end of the counter, by the window, a stool scraped back across the tile. "Stop right here for just 1 second. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your state in the comments. We read every single one, and tonight I want to know how far Dela Hartman's name travels all these years later. And if you have ever been humiliated by someone with just a little bit of power over you, fired, scolded, shamed in front of a room full of people, by someone who was counting on the fact that you couldn't fight back, type the word dignity in the comments. Type it for Della, because in about 30 seconds, somebody in that diner is going to stand up and give it back to her, in front of everyone. Don't you dare skip it. The tall man in the work shirt stood up from the last stool by the window. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. He was a big man, and the room felt the size of him before they fully turned to look, the way a doorway darkens when someone fills it. He set his coffee cup down in its saucer, very gently, the way a careful man does, and he walked the long length of that counter in no rush at all, his boot heels slow on the tile, and he came to a stop directly between Dela Hartman and the front door, so that to leave, she would have to step around him. And somehow nobody, least of all Della, was going to step around this man. He looked down at her first, then he turned and looked at Royce Tilden, and when he spoke, his voice was low and slow and unhurried, and it filled the whole diner without once being raised. "I've been sitting on that stool for 40 minutes, friend, drinking your coffee, which isn't very good, and the whole time I've been watching this woman work this room." He nodded toward the counter, the booths, the floor. "I watched her pour close to 40 cups. I watched her bus her own tables when the boy got behind. I watched her slide that young fella by the window a free refill and tell him to keep studying, he'd pass his exam. And I'll tell you what I did not watch her do. Not one single time in 40 minutes. He paused. I did not watch her go anywhere near that cash register. You count that drawer in the back, alone, don't you? By yourself. With the door shut. Royce Tilden's jaw tightened. "Sir, this is a private personnel matter, and I'll thank you too." "It stopped being private," the tall man said, "the second you did it in front of 40 paying customers. You wanted an audience for this, friend. Well, you've got one." His eyes did not move off Tilden's face. "So let's let your audience hear the whole thing, start to finish. Now, understand what this man could have done. He could have walked out of that diner clean, and not one soul on earth would have thought the worse of him. He had every reason to go. He was only passing through Tucson, on his way out to a location shoot down near old Tucson studios, due on set by 3 o'clock sharp, with a director and 100 crew already standing in the desert sun, burning expensive daylight, waiting on him. He had a car idling at the curb with a driver in it. He had no stake in a chrome diner he would never set foot in again, and no tie at all to a waitress whose name he didn't know an hour ago. He could have finished his bad coffee, left a generous $1 under the cup, tipped his hat, and driven off to his own large life, and it would have been the easy, sensible, invisible thing to do. Nobody would have called it anything but a busy man minding his own business. But instead, he reached into his shirt pocket, and the first thing he drew out wasn't his billfold. It was a question. "You said the drawer came up short how much? $68.40, spread across a whole year?" He turned, slow, to take in the whole silent room. "Let me ask the people who'd actually know. Anybody here ever watched this woman make change at that counter?" For a moment, nothing. Then a big railroad man, 3 stools down, grease on his knuckles, set down his fork and spoke up slow. "Every working day for 2 years, he said. "Never once seen her short a customer a dime. Other way around. She gives you back too much. She comes around the counter and chases you out to the sidewalk to fix it. Done it to me twice." "That's the truth," said the widow Pearson, sharp, from her corner booth. "Brought me back a nickel last Tuesday I didn't even know I'd handed her. A nickel. Who does that, if they're a thief?" "She covered my shift when my mother passed," said a younger waitress by the kitchen door, her voice cracking, "and gave me her own tips that week so I'd make rent. She's no thief. You all know she's no thief." The tall man nodded, slow, letting each voice land in the silent room. Then he turned back to Royce Tilden, and his voice dropped lower, and somehow that made it carry further. "Here's what I think happened, friend. I think a cash drawer that only ever comes up short when one particular woman works the floor, counted by one particular man, alone, in the back, behind a shut door. That is not a thief at the counter. That is a thief at the count." He let it sit. You could hear the fans turning. "I think you've been skimming that register $1 or $2 at a time for a year, maybe longer, and writing the whole off against this woman's tips where nobody'd ever question it. And then your company up in Phoenix finally added up the numbers and saw the whole, and somebody was going to have to answer for it. And you needed a name to write down before they wrote down yours. And it just so happens your wife's got a nephew who needs a job, and this here's the best station in the house." He tilted his head. "That about the size of it, Mr. Tilden?" And here is the moment the whole room had been waiting for without knowing it. Royce Tilden's face changed. It was a small thing, but 40 people saw it happen. The color came climbing up his neck above that pressed white collar, and the calm, reasonable certainty he'd worn like armor. "The drawer doesn't lie. I have no choice, it's just policy," cracked clean down the middle. It is a terrible thing for a man to hear his own private arithmetic said out loud, in plain words, in front of witnesses. For just a second, Royce Tilden looked exactly like what he was. "You can't prove a single word of that," he said. But his voice had gone thin and high, and everyone heard the difference. "No," the tall man agreed easily. "I surely can't. But here's the trouble for you, friend. You can't prove she stole either. All you've got is a ledger you keep yourself. And what I have got is 40 people in this room who just watched you call an honest, hard-working widow a thief, out loud, over money you cannot account for." He let that truth settle over the diner. "So here is what's going to happen now. Not what I'd like to happen. What is going to happen." He turned to Della, and the whole hard edge went out of his voice, and it gentled like he was talking to a spooked horse. "Ma'am, put your apron back." "Sir, I can't. He's..." "Put it back on. You are not fired. You're going to keep working in this town, with your name as clean as it ever was, because every single person in this room is going to walk out of here today remembering exactly what they saw and exactly what they heard." Then he turned back to Tilden, and the steel came back. "And you're going to open that ledger back up, and you're going to add up every dollar your register policy docked out of this woman's tips. Not for this year, for all 3 years she's worked here. And you're going to write her a check for the whole sum, honest, today, in front of these witnesses. Because if you don't, I am going to walk out to that telephone on the wall, and I'm going to call your company's main office in Phoenix, and I'm going to ask them, as a concerned customer, to send an outside man down here to count this register, alone, for 1 month, with you kept out of the cash room the whole time. And then we will all find out, won't we, whose hands that money's been sticking to." The trap closed, and the thing to notice is that it did not close with cash, not yet. It closed with the one thing a man like Royce Tilden could never survive: daylight, in front of witnesses, with an honest count hanging over his head like a blade. Tilden looked at the 40 faces turned toward him. He looked at the tall man filling the only door. There was no reasonable policy left to hide behind, no ledger that would save him now. And the comfortable lie he had lived inside his whole career came apart right there on the diner floor in front of everyone. Then, and only then, the tall man drew out his billfold. He laid $100 bill flat on the counter in front of Della. "And this here's from me, ma'am, for your trouble and for your children's. It's got nothing to do with him or his ledger." And he pressed something else into her hand besides, folded small, underneath a $1 bill, the tip he'd meant to leave for his own coffee. "I'll ask you just one thing," he said, low, so it was almost only for her. "When you're back on your feet, and you will be, you remember this hour. And someday, when you see somebody small getting stepped on by somebody who's counting on them to stay quiet and take it, you stand up. The way somebody stood up for you today. That's the whole price. Pass it on." Have you ever been made small in front of a room full of people by someone who was completely certain you would just stand there and take it? Have you ever wished, in a moment exactly like that one person, just one, would rise up out of their seat and say out loud the thing that everybody else in the room was thinking, but was too afraid to say? Have you ever stopped to wonder how much courage it really takes, not to throw a punch, not to make a scene, but simply to refuse to look away when looking away would be so much easier? Because that's the whole thing, isn't it? Cruelty depends on an audience that keeps its head down. It only ever takes one person standing up to turn a whole room. Now here is where you would expect the story to end. The stranger shames the manager. The waitress keeps her job. The crowd cheers. Roll the credits. It very nearly did not end that way, because Royce Tilden was not a man who lost gracefully, and a cornered man with a ledger and a telephone is a dangerous thing. That afternoon, the railroad men would not leave. After the tall man had pressed the bill into Della's hand and gone, 3 of them, the big one with grease on his knuckles, and 2 others off the same crew, pulled their stools around to face the back office, folded their arms, and announced they had all the time in the world. They were not leaving the Copper Spur, they said, until they personally watched Mr. Tilden open that ledger and write Mrs. Hartmann her check. They drank coffee. They waited. And under the flat stares of 3 large men who knew exactly what they'd witnessed, Royce Tilden sat down at his desk and added up 3 years of dockings he had hoped no one would ever ask about, and he wrote Dela Hartman a check for $312. He signed it with a hand that was not quite steady, and one of the railroad men took it to the bank with her himself to make sure it cleared. But that night, alone in the dark office, Tilden did the thing such men always do. He decided to get ahead of it. He picked up the telephone and called the parent company up in Phoenix, first, before any stranger could, and he told them a story. He told them he had uncovered a long-running theft at the Tucson diner, identified the responsible waitress, terminated her, recovered the missing funds, and personally restored order to the books. He painted himself the hero of his own crime. He was betting, the way men like him always bet, that a calm phone call from the manager will always beat a loud accusation from a customer nobody can name. It was a good bet. It very nearly worked. Except the tall man had made his telephone call too, earlier that same afternoon, from a payphone 2 blocks down, before he ever got in the car. And he had not called to accuse anyone of anything. He had simply asked the company, as a concerned customer who'd witnessed an ugly scene, to do one small and entirely reasonable thing. Send an outside auditor down to Tucson. Have him count the register on that lunch shift, by himself, for 30 days. Keep the manager out of the cash room while he did it. Just to be thorough. Just to be certain the theft was truly solved and would not happen again under the new arrangement. It is hard for a company to say no to a request that reasonable. So for 30 days, an outside man counted the drawer, and Royce Tilden's hands stayed nowhere near it. And in 30 days, the register on Della Hartman's old lunch shift, the shift that had supposedly bled $68 a year under a light-fingered widow, did not come up short. Not once. Not a single penny. For 30 straight days, the money balanced to the cent, perfectly, beautifully, while the widow was gone and the manager was kept clear of the cash. And that fact told the auditors in Phoenix everything they had failed to understand for 3 years. A drawer that balances the moment one man can't touch it has already named the thief. Royce Tilden was quietly dismissed in June of 1958 and asked to repay what the company could document against him. The nephew, Curtis, never did get the job, and the register policy that had been quietly docking the tips of working women across a dozen copper spur diners all over Arizona was abolished company-wide that autumn, once the Tucson audit climbed its way up the chain, though no one who benefited from its ending ever knew it had begun with one stranger and one cup of bad coffee. But the tall man was long gone before any of that came to light. He had walked out of the diner that same afternoon, back into the 91-degree heat, and crossed to the car idling at the curb. And Della had come running out after him, out onto the hot sidewalk, the $100 bill clutched in one hand and her apron strings still loose and flying, calling out to him over the noise of the street. Mister, please, at least tell me your name, so I know who to thank, so my children know whose name to say in their prayers tonight." The tall man paused with one big hand resting on the open car door, and he looked back at her, squinting against the bright Tucson sun. "I'm just a fellow who stopped in for a cup of coffee, ma'am," he said. "You go on home and take care of those children of yours, and don't you ever let a man like that one tell you what you're worth." And the car pulled out from the curb into the noon traffic, and he was gone. A busboy at the Copper Spur swore for the rest of his natural life that he had served coffee to John Wayne that April afternoon, and watched him save a waitress's job with nothing but his voice. The old cook told him he'd been to too many picture shows and dreamed the rest of it. The boy knew what he had seen. Nobody ever believed him. Della never told a living soul who she thought it had been. She could never have proven it, and she was not a woman who claimed what she couldn't prove. She had only the memory of that slow, deep voice, and the $100 bill, which she did not spend, and the small thing he had folded into her hand underneath his coffee tip. A single, ordinary dollar bill. Ordinary, except that on the white margin of it, in pencil, before he left it, he had written 4 words. "Stand up. Pass it on." That night, at her own kitchen table, Della pinned that dollar to the inside cover of her order pad, behind the curled page where she kept all her regulars' orders in shorthand. And the next morning, she put on her yellow uniform and walked back into the Copper Spur with her head held high, in front of the very same 40 people who had watched her nearly break in two the day before. Dela Hartman waited tables at the Copper Spur for 19 more years. She kept her job, and far more than the job, she kept her name, because a whole diner full of witnesses had watched a stranger stand up and defend it, and in a railroad town the size of Tucson, that kind of story travels faster than any rumor. People came in just to be served by the waitress a stranger had stood up for. She used the $100 not to pay down a single bill, but as the down payment on a small adobe house on the south side of town, the first home her family ever owned in 3 generations. And she paid off the rest of it the way she'd paid off everything in her life, 1 tip and 1 double shift at a time. Her 2 surviving children grew up in that house, in rooms with a roof that never leaked. And she did the thing the stranger had asked of her. She never forgot the hour. She kept the dollar pinned in her pad, and she watched, always, for the small ones getting stepped on. When a young busboy was cheated of 2 weeks' wages by a crooked shift manager, it was Della who marched into the office and would not come out until it was made right. When a frightened new waitress was bullied by a cook who counted on her staying silent, it was Della who stepped between them and stared the man down. The other girls came to call her the boss of the floor, though she held no such title and drew no extra pay for it. She simply refused, ever again, for the rest of her life, to be one of the 40 people who looked away. She kept the rule she had been given. When you see somebody small getting stepped on, you stand up. Pass it on. Her son grew up to be a railroad man, like the father he'd lost, and he worked the Southern Pacific Line for 31 years with a union card in his pocket and a hard word for any foreman who tried to cheat a working man of his due. Her daughter became a schoolteacher and taught 3 decades of Tucson children, and never once let a bully prosper in her classroom. And then, in time, came the granddaughter. Her name was Marisol, the schoolteacher's girl, born in 1962. She grew up steeped in the family story, the one they all called simply, "The Day the Stranger Stood Up," though her grandmother could never tell her who the stranger had been. Marisol used to climb up and take the worn old order pad down off the shelf and just stare at the pinned dollar bill with the pencil words faded soft on its margin. "Stand up. Pass it on." She must have asked her grandmother 100 times who had written those words. Della only ever gave her the same answer. A man who didn't want the credit for it, mija. Which is exactly how you know he meant it. 4 pencil words shaped an entire life. Marisol Hartmann became the first person in her family ever to go to college, and then the first ever to go beyond it. Waiting tables herself, in diners not so different from the Copper Spur, to pay her own way through law school. And when she had her degree, she did not take the easy, lucrative road. She became a labor attorney, and she spent the next 30 years suing companies for wage theft, for exactly the kind of quiet, ledger-clean, perfectly reasonable robbery that had been worked on her grandmother for 3 years out of a tip jar. She represented waitresses and busboys and hotel maids and field hands, the small ones, the quiet ones, the very people every register policy in America had ever been designed to keep silent. She won back millions of dollars in stolen wages for people who had been told, all their lives, that the drawer doesn't lie. She kept one thing framed on the wall of her office, behind her desk, where every single client who sat across from her could see it. A single, ordinary dollar bill, with 4 words written on it in faded pencil. As for Royce Tilden, dismissed in disgrace in 1958, he drifted between 2 more management jobs and was let go from both, and he died, unremarkable and unmourned, in 1979. His name survives in exactly one place on this earth, a yellowed company personnel file marked Terminated, Cause. The register policy he had enforced so proudly was abolished and forgotten within a year. The whole vast machine that had decided a working widow's word was worth less than a number in a ledger turned out, in the final accounting, to be worth nothing at all. But the dollar bill survived, and the order pad survived, and so, untouched all those years, did the $100 bill, never once spent, folded carefully inside the family Bible, because Della could never bring herself to spend a thing that had come from those hands. In 2014, after Dela Hartman died peacefully at the remarkable age of 100, Marisol came home to sort through her grandmother's things, and in a cedar box at the bottom of a closet, she found the worn old order pad, and behind the regulars page, still pinned after 56 years, the dollar bill with its 4 pencil words. And tucked into the back cover, she found a sealed envelope, in her grandmother's careful hand, that she had never once seen in all her life. On the front it read, "To whoever asks who stood up." She sat down at her grandmother's kitchen table and opened it. Inside the envelope, in her own steady handwriting, Dela Hartman had set down the whole story, just exactly the way she had carried it in silence for 56 years. The noon rush, the held-up ledger, the word thief thrown across a crowded room, the stranger on the last stool who stood up when 40 other people stayed seated, the question that cornered Royce Tilden in front of the world, the audit that finally proved the truth, the $100 bill, the 4 words pressed into her hand. She had written down what the man said to her at the car door, word for word, because she had never in her life forgotten a syllable of it. And then, at the very bottom of the last page, she explained the one secret she had kept even from her own family. Years after that April afternoon, Della wrote, a regular had come into the Copper Spur, a quiet, older man who had worked many years in the picture business out at old Tucson studios. And over coffee, she had told him, as she rarely told anyone, the story of the stranger who'd stood up for her. She had described the man's face, his height, his slow way of speaking, and the old fellow had gone very still, and then he'd set down his cup and told her something she'd never known. The tall man in the plain work shirt, who used to slip quietly into downtown Tucson in those days while he was shooting a western out in the desert, to drink his coffee in ordinary clothes where no one would trouble him. His name, his true name, the one written on his birth certificate in Winterset, Iowa, long before Hollywood ever gave him another one, was Marion Robert Morrison. The world knew him as John Wayne. Marisol sat at that kitchen table for a long, long time, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and the afternoon light moved slow across the floor. Today, that order pad and that pencil-written dollar bill do not sit in a cedar box at the bottom of a closet anymore. Marisol gave them, along with her grandmother's letter and the never-spent $100 bill, to the Arizona History Museum in Tucson, where they rest now in a glass case in the permanent exhibit on the working people of the old railroad town. The waitresses and the brakeman and the copper camp families who built the place and were so seldom remembered for it. Marisol set the pieces in the case with her own hands. She asked the curator to turn the dollar bill so that the 4 pencil words faced the window light, so that anyone who leaned in close could read them for themselves. The placard beneath the glass reads, "Waitress's order pad and tip, Copper Spur Diner, Tucson, 1958. In April of 1958, widowed waitress Dela Hartman was publicly fired and called a thief over register shortages she did not cause. A stranger at the counter stood up, exposed the truth before 40 witnesses, saved her job, and recovered 3 years of her stolen wages. On the dollar he left her, he wrote 4 words: stand up, pass it on. She did, for the rest of her life, and so has her family. The stranger refused to give his name. At the family's request, it is left off this placard, the way he wanted it. That is all it says. No name. The museum offered, more than once, to add it, and to engrave it in brass beside the case. The family said no. When the curator gently asked Marisol why, she said her grandmother had left clear instructions in her letter, and she intended to honor every word of them. He stood up in a room where every other person stayed in their seat, Marisol said, and then he drove off before she could so much as thank him, because he never once did it to be thanked. He did it so that she would do the same for somebody else someday. And she did. Her whole life she did. And then I did. That's his monument. It isn't brass on a wall. It's every last wage I ever won back for somebody small. A man like that doesn't want his name on a placard. He wanted us to stand up. So we'll keep his name the way he left it that day. So the order pad sits there in the museum light, and the 4 soft pencil words show plain on a worn old dollar bill, and the schoolchildren come through on their field trips and press their faces close to the glass to sound the words out. Stand up, pass it on. And they always ask the docent the same question. Who was the stranger? Who was the man who stood up? And the answer, printed beside the glass, is the very same answer he gave Dela Hartman at the car door, in the white Tucson heat, in the spring of 1958. Just a fellow who stopped in for a cup of coffee. And it is enough. If this story reached you tonight, do me a favor, pass it on. Share it with a waitress, with a single mother, with any working person who was ever made small by somebody counting on their silence. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. There are more Duke stories coming every night at midnight, and unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.